Can you believe it? That ragged old woman sleeping in the freezing basement, treated like a mere servant by her own daughter-in-law, is actually the rightful owner of a billion-dollar fortune. For 20 years, Margaret swallowed her tears, accepting the humiliation of being called a freeloader just to keep the peace within the family. But human greed knows no bounds. When her daughter-in-law Scarlett and the mistress plotted to kick her out onto the street, they made an irreversible mistake. Little did they know, Margaret was holding on to a devastating secret, the proof that her own divorce was never finalized, rendering the entire fortune built by her ex-husband's new family legally hers. Today, prepare yourself to witness the most spectacular turnaround. From a despised servant, watch how Margaret forces those arrogant souls to their knees. The truth revealed in the courtroom is guaranteed to give you goosebumps. And before we begin the story, please leave a comment letting us know where you are tuning in from. The courtroom was in complete silence. All eyes were fixed on the woman with gray hair and a steady gaze standing before the judge. Margaret was not the same old woman many had seen as a burden. Her back was straight, her expression serene, but her presence commanded respect. On the other side, Scarlett could barely stand. Her hands trembled, her breathing was erratic, her entire world was crumbling. "Your Honor," said Margaret's lawyer with a firm voice, "what we are about to reveal will demonstrate that my client has been the victim of one of the greatest family injustices in recent years." Mason, Scarlett's husband and Margaret's son, couldn't believe what he was seeing. For all of his adult life, he had ignored his mother, allowing his wife to treat her like a nuisance. But now, in that courtroom, everything he thought he knew was about to fall apart. The judge struck the desk with her gavel and stared at Margaret. "Mrs. Margaret, you have the floor." The old woman took a step forward, and everyone held their breath. But before she could speak, the image freezes, because to understand how this woman got here, we must first go back 6 months in time. The sun was barely beginning to illuminate the streets of Richmond, Virginia, when Margaret felt the pain in her back as she got up from her small mattress in the basement room. At 67, her life was nothing more than a reflection of humiliation. She lived in her son's house, not as a respected mother, but as a maid. She was in charge of cleaning, cooking, and doing all the household chores, only to receive looks of contempt from her daughter-in-law. For 20 years, I became a ghost in my own life. I wasn't just a maid. I was a reminder of a past they wanted to erase. Every time I scrubbed their floors, I was scrubbing away a little more of my dignity. I learned to make myself small, to swallow my words until they tasted like ash in my mouth. I told myself I stayed for Mason, my son, hoping that one day he would see me, really see me. But silence isn't a shield. It's a prison. And in that cold basement, listening to the footsteps of the people who despised me, I realized I was waiting for a permission to live that no one was ever going to give me. "Old and slow," shouted Scarlett from the kitchen. "How many times do I have to tell you to serve my coffee the way I like it? You always do everything wrong." Margaret didn't answer. She lowered her gaze and approached with a hot cup. Her son Mason was sitting at the table reading the newspaper, ignoring the scene as always. "I don't know why you keep her here," continued Scarlett, looking at him with annoyance. "It would cost us less to put her in a nursing home." The words hurt, but Margaret showed no emotion. She had learned to endure. "She's my mother," murmured Mason without even looking up. Scarlett let out a mocking laugh. "Since when does that matter?" Margaret sighed and went out to the backyard. She looked up at the sky and closed her eyes. No one knew the truth. No one knew who she really was. If destiny wanted it that way, one day the truth would come to light, and that day was closer than they imagined. That afternoon, Margaret went out to buy bagels. Her dress was simple, her hair pulled back in a bun, and her walk slow. She walked through the Main Street Market, a place full of vendors, food smells, and voices mixing in the air. Suddenly, she felt a gaze fixed on her. "Margaret." A gravelly male voice filled with astonishment made her stop. She turned slowly and saw a man with gray hair in an elegant suit and a fine wooden cane. "Robert," she whispered, feeling a shiver run down her back. That man had been her partner in another life, in a life where she wasn't a despised old woman but a powerful woman. Robert watched her with disbelief. "It can't be," he murmured. "What happened to you?" Margaret felt her heart beating strongly. "It's a long story," she replied with a trembling voice. But what she didn't know was that this meeting would change her destiny forever. Upon arriving home, Scarlett was in the living room with her arms crossed and a look of annoyance. "Finally, what did you do? Did you stay gossiping with the neighbors?" "I bought bagels," replied Margaret without even looking up. "You always have an excuse," exclaimed Scarlett, snatching the bag from her hands. "I don't know why you're still here. It would cost us less to put you in a nursing home." Mason said nothing. He just dropped onto the couch and turned on the TV. Margaret felt her chest tighten, but she didn't respond. It wasn't worth arguing, not with Scarlett. When she finished washing the dishes, she retired to her small basement room. She closed the door and sat on the bed, staring at the floor. She thought of Robert, of his words. Something inside her told her she hadn't gone to that market by chance. And she was right, because the next day, at the same table where they always humiliated her, she would receive a letter, one that would change everything. Margaret woke up before dawn as usual, not because she wanted to, but because the cold in her small room and the pain in her back didn't allow her to sleep more than a few hours straight. She lay for a moment on the thin mattress, observing the ceiling with a clouded mind. The conversation with Robert the day before kept spinning in her head. Why had he come back to see her after so many years? Did he know what had happened to her? The first rays of sun were entering through the small window when a sharp knock on the door made her sit up. "Wake up already," shouted Scarlett from the other side. "I didn't bring you to this house to sleep in." Margaret sighed and got up, ignoring the twinge in her knee. There was no point in arguing. She took a worn shawl and headed to the kitchen to prepare breakfast for the family like every day. Scarlett sat at the table with her phone in her hand, without even looking at her. Mason was skimming the newspaper and barely looked up when his mother placed a cup of coffee in front of him. "Drink it before it gets cold," she said softly. But before she could move away, Scarlett interrupted her. "For God's sake, how many times do I have to tell you I don't want sugar in my coffee?" she exclaimed with disgust, slamming the cup on the table. "You always do everything wrong." Margaret lowered her head and took the cup without saying a word. She knew it didn't matter what she did. Scarlett would always find something to criticize. As she emptied the coffee into the sink and prepared a fresh cup, she felt the weight of the years on her shoulders. This wasn't her place. It never had been. The sound of the mail carrier leaving letters at the entrance broke the tension of the moment. Mason got up and took the small stack of envelopes, checking them without much interest. "Junk mail, electric bill," he murmured while skimming them. "This is for you, Mom." Margaret looked up and saw a yellow envelope in his hands. There was no return address. Her name was handwritten with a firm and elegant calligraphy. "What is that?" asked Scarlett suspiciously. "I don't know," replied the old woman, feeling a strange restlessness as she held the envelope. She put it in her apron pocket and finished serving breakfast, but her mind was elsewhere. When Scarlett and Mason finished eating and left the house, Margaret went to her room with the envelope in her hand. She sat on the edge of the bed and took a deep breath before opening it. Inside was only a single sheet with a short message, but it made her heart beat wildly. "Meet me this afternoon on the bench in front of St. Paul's Church. There are things you need to know. Don't miss it." There was no signature, no more details. But Margaret knew who had sent it. Robert. For the first time in many years, she felt something resembling hope. The rest of the day passed slowly. Her hands worked automatically as she cleaned the house, but her mind was on the meeting she would have later. When she finally finished her chores and Scarlett left with some friends, Margaret dressed as best she could and went out towards the church. Downtown Richmond was full of people. Street vendors offered their products, tourists took photos of the historic architecture, and cars moved with difficulty through the afternoon traffic. Upon arriving at St. Paul's Church, she searched for the bench mentioned in the letter. There was Robert, waiting for her with a serious face. "I knew you would come," he said when he saw her approaching. Margaret sat beside him, suddenly feeling like a much younger woman. "Tell me the truth, Robert. Why are you here after so many years?" The man sighed, looking at her with eyes full of a sorrow that spanned decades. "Because it is time you stop paying for a crime you didn't commit, Margaret." The mention of Charles made her heart clench not with love, but with the old familiar ache of betrayal. "I know my story, Robert," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was the wife who wasn't enough, the woman easily discarded." "No," Robert interrupted gently, leaning forward. "You were never discarded. You were erased. There is a difference." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Charles didn't just steal your fortune, he stole your history. He made you believe you were powerless so he wouldn't have to face the magnitude of his own sin. But a lie, no matter how expensive, cannot live forever." Margaret's heart raced. "What are you talking about?" Robert pressed his lips together and then handed her an envelope similar to the one she had received that morning. "Open this when you get home. Inside is the truth." Margaret took it with trembling hands. "Why don't you tell me now?" Robert sighed. "Because there are things that are better discovered alone." She felt a chill. She didn't know what could be worse than what she had already lived, but inside, a voice told her that nothing would ever be the same after opening that envelope. Margaret walked back home with the envelope in her hands, feeling its weight as if it carried something more than a simple letter inside. She didn't dare open it on the street. She knew that what she was about to discover would change her life forever, and if she had learned anything over the years, it was that certain truths must be faced in solitude. The sunset painted the sky of Virginia with reddish and golden tones when she arrived at Mason's house. She entered quietly, hoping to avoid Scarlett, and went immediately to her small basement room. She closed the door carefully, sat on the bed, and with trembling hands broke the seal of the envelope. Inside, she found several documents aged by time and a handwritten note by Robert. "Margaret, the truth that was stolen from you is here. Now it depends on you what you will do with it." Her breathing quickened as she pulled out the first document. It was a copy of her old marriage contract with Charles, but beneath it were other documents. Her eyes scanned the legal papers until they landed on the official court filing for their divorce. And there, she found something that froze her blood. The divorce petition had been filed, but the final decree was never signed by the judge. It was marked, "Dismissed for lack of follow-up." That meant when Charles married Patricia, he was still legally married to her. That meant that when Charles married Patricia, he was still legally married to her. Her hands began to tremble. If that was true, Charles's marriage to Patricia had never been valid. His assets, the company, the properties, everything legally remained hers. She felt like she couldn't breathe. For years, she had believed that her destiny was misery, that she had nothing and no one. But now she understood she had lived, deceived. She continued reviewing the documents. There were bank records, transactions made by Charles before disappearing. The most shocking part, evidence that he had forged her signature on various contracts to strip her of her shares in the company they had built together. Margaret felt a mixture of rage and pain. Not only had he abandoned her, not only had he humiliated her, but he had stolen everything that was hers. And the worst part was that during all these years, she herself had accepted her destiny without fighting. She stored the papers carefully, as if they were the key to her future. She knew she had to act with caution. She couldn't run the risk of Scarlett or Mason discovering what she had found. Not yet, but someone else needed to know. She left her room and, making sure Scarlett wasn't nearby, picked up the house landline. Her fingers dialed a number she hadn't dialed in years. "Robert." Her voice sounded stronger than she expected. "We need to talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line before he responded. "I knew it, Margaret. I knew that when you saw the documents, you would understand everything. Meet me at my office tomorrow." She nodded, although he couldn't see her. "Tomorrow," she repeated. She hung up the phone with her heart racing. There was no turning back. The next morning, Margaret waited until Mason and Scarlett had left the house. She immediately went to Robert's law firm, where his secretary showed her in immediately. Robert was waiting for her behind a dark wood desk with an open folder in front of him. When she sat down, he handed her a document without saying a word. It was a legal report. "I checked the records," he finally said. "Your divorce was never finalized, which means the inheritance Charles left to Patricia and her children should never have been theirs." Margaret felt a chill. "That means I can recover what belongs to me?" Robert nodded. "But it won't be easy. Patricia and her children aren't going to stand by with their arms crossed when they find out they could lose everything. And even less so if Scarlett and Mason find out you aren't the submissive woman they think you are. Margaret remained silent. For the first time in years, she had power in her hands. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. She took a deep breath and looked up. "I'm ready." Robert looked at her with approval. "Then get ready. This won't be a simple legal battle. This will be a war." Margaret held the documents tightly. She knew her life was about to change. What she didn't imagine was how quickly Scarlett would discover that she was no longer the same submissive woman as before. Margaret left Robert's office with a feeling she hadn't experienced in decades. Power. She had spent more than 20 years being invisible, enduring humiliations, living like a shadow in her own son's house. But now, with those papers in her hands, everything had changed. As she walked through the streets of downtown Richmond, she felt her heart beating strongly not from fear, but from something deeper, a determination that had been dormant inside her for too long. Charles had snatched her life, her dignity, her future away, but he wouldn't succeed a second time. Upon arriving home, she found the living room empty. Scarlett was probably shopping or at some cafe with her friends. Mason wasn't there either. It was the perfect moment. She went to her basement room, closed the door carefully, and spread all the documents Robert had given her on the bed. Her hands ran over the sheets with a mixture of excitement and contained rage. The bank records showed how Charles had transferred millions of dollars to offshore accounts before disappearing. The property deeds indicated that the house where Patricia and her children lived was actually still legally in Margaret's name. And most shocking of all, Charles's will was invalid because he had never been legally divorced from her. All that money, those properties, those companies, they belonged to her. The injustice she had endured for so many years was greater than she had imagined. Not only had she been deceived by her husband, but the law was on her side. She had the right to recover what belonged to her. But before taking the first step, there was something she had to do. She took a deep breath and put all the documents in a folder. She had to keep them hidden. If Scarlett found them, she would do everything possible to destroy them. She went to the closet, pushed the few clothes she had aside, and slid the folder to the back, behind a box of old photographs. Just as she was closing the closet door, she heard the front door burst open. "I can't believe it." Scarlett's voice resonated with fury in the living room. "Mason, your mother is hiding something." Margaret's stomach knotted with anxiety. She slowly left her room and found Scarlett standing in the middle of the living room with her arms crossed and a look full of suspicion. Mason, standing next to her, looked uncomfortable, as if he didn't want to be there. "What are you talking about, Scarlett?" asked Margaret calmly. "Don't play innocent." Scarlett narrowed her eyes. "I saw you downtown. I saw you enter an office with that old man, Robert. What do you have to do with him?" Margaret felt her chest tighten. She had been careless. She didn't imagine Scarlett would follow her. "That is none of your business," she replied with a firm voice, surprising even herself. Scarlett raised an eyebrow, clearly disconcerted by the answer. "Since when do you have secrets?" Scarlett took a step toward her with a mocking smile. "What are you up to? Or are you planning to finally leave this house and stop being our burden?" Mason frowned at the harshness of his wife's words but said nothing, as always. Margaret took a deep breath. It wasn't time for confrontations. Not yet. "I don't have to explain my affairs to you, Scarlett." The woman let out a laugh full of sarcasm. "Affairs? You?" She crossed her arms. "Don't make me laugh." There was a tense silence. Scarlett watched her with confidence, trying to read some clue in her face. But Margaret had learned to hide her emotions. After a few seconds, Scarlett snorted and turned to Mason. "I told you, she's plotting something. If later you don't realize your mother is getting us into trouble, don't say I didn't warn you." Mason sighed, visibly tired of the argument. "Drop it, Scarlett. We don't have time for this." She gritted her teeth but didn't insist. She took her purse and left the house without saying more. When the door closed, Mason stood silent for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Mom," his voice sounded softer, "is really nothing going on?" Margaret looked him in the eyes. For an instant, she felt the need to tell him everything, but she couldn't. Mason loved Scarlett, and if she told him the truth now, everything would get complicated too quickly. So she smiled, feigning tranquility. "Don't worry, son. Everything is fine." He nodded slowly, although he didn't seem entirely convinced. When Mason went up to his room, Margaret returned to her room and locked the door. She leaned against the wood, feeling her breath quicken. She knew Scarlett wouldn't leave the matter alone. She knew the first step had been taken, and she knew the war was about to begin. The following days passed with a tense calm in Mason and Scarlett's house. Margaret knew her daughter-in-law hadn't forgotten the matter, that at any moment she would try to discover what she was plotting. She wasn't a woman who let anything slide, much less if she had the slightest suspicion that something was escaping her control. Margaret kept herself discreet, fulfilling her daily chores as always, but inside, a storm was unleashed. Every time she was alone in her room, she took out the documents Robert had given her and reviewed them carefully, trying to memorize them, trying to understand the best way to proceed. She knew she couldn't rush. A single mistake, and Scarlett would ruin everything. But her caution wasn't enough. One afternoon, while she was finishing cleaning the kitchen, she heard a noise in her room. Her heart stopped for a second. She walked cautiously to the door and found it ajar. Pushing it open, she saw Scarlett leaning over her closet, rummaging through her things. Her blood boiled. "What are you doing?" Scarlett turned sharply, her face hardened but without the slightest sign of guilt. "Looking for answers." Margaret entered the room and closed the door behind her. "You have no right to touch my things." Scarlett crossed her arms and smiled mockingly. "You have nothing, so I don't see what I could possibly find here." Margaret felt the urge to scream at her, but she held back. She couldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. "Get out of my room." "Tell me the truth first," Scarlett observed her carefully. "I know you're plotting something. I've seen you go out more than usual. You aren't the same submissive woman as before. What are you hiding?" Margaret remained silent. "You're not going to talk?" Scarlett narrowed her eyes. "Very well, then I'll have to find out on my own." She left the room with the same arrogance with which she had entered, leaving a heavy air behind her. Margaret collapsed onto the bed and felt her hands trembling. Scarlett was close, too close. She had to act before her daughter-in-law did. The next day, she decided to meet with Robert again. She found him in his office like the previous time, reviewing some documents. When he looked up and saw her enter, he knew something had happened. "Scarlett suspects," she said bluntly as she sat in front of him. Robert frowned. "It was a matter of time. She's astute. More than that, she's dangerous." Margaret rubbed her hands, feeling the weight of the situation. "She searched my room." Robert clicked his tongue. "We need to move fast." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a new folder, sliding it toward her. "These are the official documents to initiate the legal process. As soon as we sign them, everything will be public. Patricia and her children will know the truth. And Scarlett, too." Margaret took the folder with trembling hands. She had waited for this moment, but now that she had it in front of her, she felt a knot in her stomach. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked Robert with a look that said it all. Margaret looked up and nodded. "It's time to recover what is mine." She signed the documents with determination. When she left the office, the sun was shining brightly over the streets of Richmond, but inside, a shadow loomed over her. She knew that upon crossing the door of her house, there would be no turning back. And she was right, because when she arrived, she found Scarlett waiting for her in the living room with crossed arms and a face more serious than ever. "I just received a call," she said with a cold voice. "Why does a lawyer want to talk to you?" Margaret felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She stood motionless in the entrance of the house while Scarlett observed her with crossed arms and an expression of absolute disdain. "Are you not going to answer?" insisted Scarlett with a frown. "Since when does a poor old woman like you need a lawyer?" Margaret took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She knew any false word could fuel her daughter-in-law's suspicions. "That is none of your business," she replied with a firm voice. Scarlett blinked, surprised. She didn't expect that reaction. She was used to her mother-in-law lowering her head and submitting without argument. "What do you mean it's none of my business?" she scoffed, taking a step toward her. You live in my house, you eat my food, you use my electricity, and it is not your house." Margaret's voice resonated with a dangerous calm, cutting Scarlett's words like a knife. Scarlett narrowed her eyes. "What did you say?" "That this house is not yours. It belongs to Mason." Finally, the silence breaks. After 20 years of bowing her head, Margaret is stepping into her power, and Scarlett has no idea that the ground beneath her feet is about to crumble. Keep listening, because the war for this family is just getting started. For the first time, Scarlett didn't have an immediate answer. For years she had acted as if she were the absolute owner of everything around her, including Margaret's life. And now, for the first time, her mother-in-law wasn't behaving like the servile old woman she was used to. "You are hiding something," murmured Scarlett with a cynical smile. "But don't worry, I'll find out." With that, she spun on her heels and left the room, leaving a heavy air behind her. Margaret stood for a few seconds before heading to her room. She locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, feeling the accumulated exhaustion in every fiber of her body. The time had come to act. The next day, she returned to Robert's office. This time, the man received her with a folder full of documents representing the start of her legal battle. "Here is everything we need to present the case," said Robert. "I've spoken with a team of lawyers specializing in asset fraud. The lawsuit against Patricia and her children will be solid." Margaret took the folder with firm hands. There was no turning back. "I want to do it." Robert nodded with approval. "The first thing that will happen is they will receive a formal notification. Then there will be an initial hearing to determine if the case has merit." "It does," affirmed Margaret without hesitation. Robert smiled. "We know that, but they will fight tooth and nail to avoid it. Patricia and her children have lived with that fortune all their lives. They won't stand by with crossed arms while we take everything from them." Margaret already knew that. Charles had stripped her of her own existence without her being able to do anything at the time. But now she had control, and she didn't plan to let go. "I'm going to recover what is mine," she said in a low voice, "whatever the cost." She left the office with the feeling of having taken the most important step of her life. But what she didn't know was that Scarlett was about to make her own move. Margaret didn't look away from Scarlett. Her daughter-in-law remained standing in the living room with crossed arms, with an expression oscillating between contempt and suspicion. "I said a lawyer called to talk to you," repeated Scarlett, this time with a more incisive tone. "Are you going to explain what it's about? Or do I have to find out on my own?" Margaret felt her heart beating strongly, but her exterior remained serene. She had expected this moment. She knew Scarlett wouldn't stay quiet. "It's not your concern," she responded calmly. Scarlett's face hardened. "Everything that happens in this house concerns me. Or are you planning to sue us for not bringing you breakfast in bed?" Margaret let out a dry laugh. "I would do that if I believed there was anything left in this house that belongs to me." For an instant, Scarlett lost her composure. Her eyes widened slightly, and her jaw tightened. There was something in the way her mother-in-law answered that she didn't like at all. But before she could insist, Mason came down the stairs. "Why so much noise?" he asked with a tired voice. Scarlett turned to him immediately. "Your mother has a lawyer. Did you know that?" Mason frowned and looked at Margaret. "Is that true, Mom?" Margaret nodded without a trace of doubt. "Yes." The silence that followed was thick. Mason ran a hand over the back of his neck as if trying to find an explanation. "But what do you need a lawyer for?" "To resolve pending matters," she replied without further details. Scarlett let out an ironic laugh. "Pending matters? Since when do you have something important to resolve?" "For more than 20 years. Margaret's tone was cold, cutting. Scarlett and Mason exchanged glances. It was evident something was happening, something escaping them. Finally, Scarlett rolled her eyes and sighed. "You know what? Do what you want. But don't drag Mason into this." With that, she grabbed her purse and left the house with a quickened pace. Mason, on the other hand, stayed in his spot. He looked at his mother carefully and then shook his head. "I don't understand what's going on with you, Mom," he murmured. "But I hope it's nothing that brings us problems." Margaret didn't answer. Her son didn't know it, but the problems were already on the way. The official notification of the lawsuit against Patricia and her children arrived 3 days later. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard the doorbell. She walked to the door and opened it, finding a man dressed in a suit with a folder in his hand. "Mrs. Margaret?" asked the man with formality. "Yes. This is an official notification of the lawsuit you recently filed." He handed her the folder and left without further ado. Margaret felt the weight of the document in her hands. It was real. It had begun. She closed the door and took the folder to her room. With firm hands, she opened it and reviewed its content. Everything was in order. The lawsuit had been formally presented, and Charles's family would soon receive the notification. The first blow had been struck. But what she didn't know was that at that same moment, in another part of Richmond, Patricia, Charles's widow, was receiving her own copy of the document, and her reaction would be anything but peaceful. Patricia's scream of fury resonated throughout the house. The notification of the lawsuit slipped from her hands while her eyes scanned the lines again and again, unable to believe what she was reading. "What kind of joke is this?" she exclaimed, throwing the papers onto the marble table of the luxurious living room. Her children, Tyler and Chloe, approached worriedly. They had never seen their mother react like this. "Mom, what's wrong?" asked Tyler, picking up the documents. Chloe's eyes widened like plates upon reading the name of the plaintiff. "It can't be," she whispered. "Margaret." Patricia stood up abruptly, breathing with difficulty. That woman is trying to take everything from us." She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and dialed a number furiously. "Who are you calling?" asked Tyler. "Our lawyer. We're going to stop this before it turns into a scandal." While she tried to stop the blow that was coming, in another part of Richmond, Scarlett was planning her own move. She had silently observed Margaret over the last few days. Her mother-in-law was no longer the weak and servile woman she had belittled for years. Now she moved with unusual confidence, as if she knew something the others ignored. Scarlett was not willing to allow it. That afternoon, she waited for Mason to arrive from work and received him with a serious expression. "We need to talk," she said, crossing her arms. Mason left his briefcase on the table and sighed. "Again with the stuff about my mom?" "It's not again," she replied with impatience. "It's something serious." Mason, her husband, looked at her with weariness but dropped onto the couch. "I'm listening." Scarlett sat next to him, taking his hand gently, as if she were truly worried. "I'm sure your mother is hiding something from us," she whispered, with an almost affectionate voice. "I don't want her to hurt you." Mason frowned. "Why do you think that?" "Today I saw a notification from a lawyer. I couldn't read it, but it can't be anything good." Mason tensed. "What do you mean, a notification?" "I don't know, but it gives me a bad feeling." "Mason, please tell me you don't think this is normal. Your mother has never done anything out of the ordinary, and suddenly she's going to meetings with lawyers?" Mason remained silent. A part of him wanted to trust his mother, but Scarlett was right about something. She was acting differently. "Maybe we should talk to her," proposed Mason. Scarlett pressed her lips together and feigned doubt. "I don't know if she'll tell us the truth, but we can find out another way." Mason looked at her with distrust. "What are you suggesting?" Scarlett squeezed his hand tighter. "Let's look for the papers. If she has nothing to hide, we won't find anything. But if she is hiding something, we deserve to know." Mason withdrew his hand slowly and shook his head. "No, Scarlett, I'm not going to spy on my mother." For the first time in years, Mason was saying no to her. Scarlett had to contain her anger, but she didn't plan to give up. If Mason wouldn't help her, then she would do it alone, and in less than 24 hours, she would discover everything. Scarlett woke up restless. She hadn't slept well since the conversation with Mason. She shifted in bed, feeling the weight of uncertainty on her shoulders. There was something about her mother-in-law that didn't add up, something that made her feel like she was losing control of the house and everything she had built in her favor in recent years. She glanced sideways at Mason, who was sleeping deeply beside her. He wouldn't help her, that was clear. But Scarlett didn't need his permission to discover the truth. She got up stealthily, making sure not to make noise. She put on a robe, tied back her hair, and walked lightly down the hallway until reaching Margaret's basement room. The deadbolt was thrown. "Clever," whispered Scarlett with a crooked smile. She went back to her room, took a couple of bobby pins, and returned with patience. She slid them into the lock until she felt a slight click. The door opened with a light creak. Margaret's room was small and modest, with an old wardrobe and a narrow bed. Scarlett approached the closet and began looking through the clothes. Her hands moved quickly, pushing aside fabrics, checking drawers, until she found it, a thick folder hidden in the back of the closet, under some old blankets. Scarlett took it carefully and opened it. Her expression hardened upon seeing the contents. They were legal documents, deeds, bank records, dates, names. And there was Charles. Her heart began to beat strongly. Her hands sweated as she turned the pages. Something didn't fit. Then, her eyes stopped on a particular document. It was a marriage certificate. Charles and Margaret. Scarlett felt her stomach turn. If those documents were real, it meant Patricia was never Charles's legitimate wife. It meant that everything they had, every penny, every property legally belonged to the old woman she had despised for years. A noise in the hallway snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned just in time to see Margaret standing in the doorway, observing her with an impenetrable look. "You should be more careful with what you touch," said the old woman with a calm voice, but with an icy edge to every word. Scarlett felt trapped. Her first instinct was to hide the folder behind her, but the gesture was too obvious. Margaret closed the door behind her and took a step forward. "Did you think I didn't know you were going to do this?" she asked calmly. Scarlett pressed her lips together and raised her chin with arrogance. "What is all this?" she asked, trying to sound firm, but her voice trembled a little. Margaret extended her hand. "Give them to me." Scarlett held the papers tighter. "Why don't you tell me the truth, mother-in-law? What is your plan? Are you going to rob us?" Margaret let out a slight laugh, but without a trace of humor. "What is in those papers is not theft, Scarlett. It is what was always mine." The old woman's tone made her shudder. Scarlett looked her in the eyes. For the first time, she saw something in her she had never noticed before. Power. Margaret was no longer the submissive woman she had treated like a burden for years. Scarlett felt a chill, but she wasn't going to give up. She pressed the papers against her chest and forced a smile. "Mason has the right to know this." Margaret tilted her head without looking away from her daughter-in-law. "Tell him. Go and tell him everything. But when you do, make sure to also explain what you found in those documents. Tell him how his father cheated on his mother. Tell him how Patricia and her children have lived off what doesn't belong to them." Scarlett opened her mouth but couldn't say anything, because Margaret was right. If Mason discovered the truth, whose side would he take? Scarlett stood motionless, feeling that for the first time her mother-in-law had the advantage, and that terrified her. The silence in Patricia's mansion was broken by the sound of glass shattering against the floor. She had thrown a wine glass so hard against the wall that the shards still vibrated on the marble. "This is insane," she screamed with agitated breathing and a flushed face. "That old woman thinks she can take everything from us?" Tyler and Chloe looked at each other, not knowing what to say. Since their mother had received the lawsuit notification, she had become a whirlwind of uncontrollable fury. "Mom, calm down," Chloe tried to say. "How do you want me to calm down?" interrupted Patricia, turning with burning eyes. "If we lose this case, we lose everything." Tyler took the papers on the table and read them more calmly. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, frowning. "Dad was supposed to have left everything in order before dying." "Oh, that's what we thought," replied Patricia, gritting her teeth. "How is it possible that there is something that old woman can use against us?" At that moment, the main door opened, and a man in a dark suit with an imposing bearing entered with a confident step. It was Mr. Harrison, the family lawyer, a man who had worked with Charles for years and knew all his client's secrets. Patricia looked at him with desperation. "Tell me this is a mistake." Harrison left his briefcase on the table and exhaled heavily. "It's not a mistake, Patricia. I've reviewed the documents. The problem is more serious than we imagined." Patricia collapsed onto the sofa, feeling for the first time the true weight of the threat. What does that mean? That Charles and Margaret's divorce was never legally finalized, explained the lawyer with a firm voice. Which means that in the eyes of the law, Patricia, you were never his wife. The silence in the room was sepulchral. Tyler ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what he had just heard. Wait, are you telling me that technically my father lived in concubinage with my mother while he was still married to that woman? Harrison nodded seriously. Not only that, since the divorce was never valid, everything Charles acquired after their separation is still considered part of his marital partnership with Margaret. Patricia's eyes widened with terror. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, Harrison continued mercilessly. If this goes to trial and the court rules in favor of Margaret, you will lose all the properties, the bank accounts, the company shares, and even this house. Patricia felt like she couldn't breathe. Her whole life, every luxury, every penny, everything she had taken for granted could disappear. She stood up abruptly and looked at Harrison with determination. I won't allow it. Patricia, the case is solid, the lawyer tried to warn. I don't care how solid it is, she interrupted him with eyes injected with fury. Find a way to stop this. Harrison narrowed his eyes, analyzing her reaction. There are only two ways to prevent this from going to trial: discredit Margaret or negotiate with her. Patricia let out a bitter laugh. Negotiate with that woman? Never. Tyler crossed his arms. Then only the first option remains. Chloe frowned. What are you suggesting? Tyler smiled coldly. Destroy her credibility. Patricia pressed her lips together. She knew they couldn't risk losing. If they had to sink Margaret before she sank them, they would do it. She turned to Harrison with an expression of absolute resolve. Do whatever you have to do. Harrison nodded slowly. I know some people who can help us. Patricia exhaled deeply. Then don't waste time. Meanwhile, at Mason's house, Margaret was reviewing documents with Robert, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. But it wouldn't be long before she discovered it, because the next morning her name would be in the newspapers, and what they would say about her would not be good at all. The sound of the door closing forcefully resonated throughout the house. Patricia threw her coat over the leather armchair and walked firmly toward the study where Tyler and Chloe were waiting for her. Harrison, her lawyer, was seated with his hands clasped on the table, his expression impenetrable. Did you find anything out? Asked Patricia bluntly, addressing Harrison. The man nodded slowly. My contacts have informed me that Margaret's case is more solid than we thought. Not only does she have conclusive proof that the divorce never happened, but she also has documents showing that Charles transferred assets fraudulently. Tyler clenched his fists. So what can we do? Harrison exhaled heavily and looked at the three of them. Legally, the only way to stop this would be to prove that Margaret is unfit to claim the inheritance. Chloe narrowed her eyes. Unfit? How? The lawyer leaned back in his chair with a calculating gesture. We can try to prove that Margaret is not in full use of her faculties, that she is mentally unstable, that her memory is deficient, or that she has had episodes questioning her judgment. Patricia slammed the table hard. That's ridiculous. That woman isn't crazy. Harrison raised an eyebrow. She doesn't need to be. We just need people to believe it. Silence fell in the room. Patricia looked at her children and then looked back at the lawyer. Do you have something in mind? Harrison took his phone and swiped the screen. I have a couple of contacts in the press willing to publish a story about her if the payment is good. Tyler smiled cynically. So we're going to dirty her name. Exactly, affirmed Harrison. If public opinion perceives her as a confused, out-of-it old woman, the judge will take it into account. Patricia felt a strange satisfaction run through her body. If Margaret wanted to play with fire, she wouldn't stand by with crossed arms. Do it, she ordered without hesitation. The next day, the scandal erupted in the newspapers and on social media. Margaret, the elderly woman claiming to own the Charles fortune, has a history of erratic behavior and inconsistent statements. Sources close to her claim she has had episodes of disorientation and that her sudden inheritance claim could be due to confusion typical of age. When Margaret read the article, she felt a pang in her chest. She sat at the breakfast table with the newspaper in her hands, while Scarlett, standing by the coffee maker, feigned surprise. "How terrible," she murmured with fake compassion. "People invent horrible things, don't they?" Margaret pressed her lips together. She knew perfectly well who was behind this. But she wouldn't stay silent. Because if Patricia wanted to play dirty, she also knew how to fight. The sound of the newspaper being folded brusquely broke the silence at the breakfast table. Mason left the sheet on the table, his fingers still pressing the edges tightly. His dark eyes scanned the lines again, but indignation didn't allow him to find any logic in what he was reading. "Where did this come from?" he murmured with a frown. Margaret, sitting at the other end of the table, observed her son's reaction with serenity. She had already read every word of that article. Margaret, a decaying old woman, claims to be the legitimate heir to the Charles fortune. Sources close inform that she has had episodes of confusion and that her sudden legal action could be the result of delusions caused by her advanced age. Is this woman really in a condition to handle a fortune, or is it just a whim of a disturbed mind? "Seems the press found the new gossip of the day," replied Scarlett with a mocking smile while stirring sugar into her coffee. Mason looked at her with disbelief. "You find this funny?" Scarlett raised an eyebrow. "It's not my fault people talk. Besides, we all know these kinds of lawsuits don't end well." Margaret didn't look away from her daughter-in-law. She knew perfectly well those words weren't accidental. Scarlett had been waiting for this moment. Mason exhaled with frustration and turned to his mother. "Mom, what is all this? Are you really suing my dad's family?" Margaret held his gaze firmly. "Yes." The silence at the table became heavy. Mason took a moment to process it. "Why?" he finally asked. "Because it is the right thing," she responded without hesitation. "Because what Charles took from me belongs to me." Scarlett let out a sarcastic laugh. "Do you really think you can win, mother-in-law?" Margaret ignored her completely. Mason rubbed his forehead as if trying to clear his thoughts. "Mom, this is crazy. How did you not tell me anything?" "Because you wouldn't have understood," said Margaret calmly. "Because you've spent years listening to the wrong person." Scarlett narrowed her eyes. "Oh, sure. Now it turns out I'm the bad guy." Mason looked at her warningly. "I'm not talking to you, Scarlett." The tone with which he said it was enough for his wife to shut her mouth for a moment. Margaret rested her hands on the table and looked at her son with a mixture of tenderness and hardness. "I don't expect you to understand now. But I do expect you to listen, Mason, because this time I am not going to stay silent." Mason felt a knot in his chest. He had never seen his mother like this. She wasn't the weak woman he remembered. She was someone else, one who wouldn't stop. And that terrified him. The courtroom was in complete silence. Only the sound of papers being arranged on the judge's table and the muffled whispers of lawyers reviewing their notes could be heard. Margaret sat with her back straight, hands clasped on her lap. Beside her, Robert reviewed documents with his usual patience. Opposite them, Patricia remained rigid with a tense expression, lips pressed into a thin line. Tyler and Chloe flanked her with somber gestures. Mr. Harrison, Patricia's lawyer, stood up confidently and adjusted his tie before speaking. "Your Honor, we want to state that my client has been the victim of an attempted dispossession orchestrated by a woman who clearly is not in a condition to handle a fortune of this magnitude." The words floated in the air, charged with poison. Margaret, a woman who spent more than 20 years living in poverty, has decided overnight that she is the legitimate heir of Charles. However, we want this court to evaluate if she really has the capacity to make decisions about an estate of such size. The murmurs in the room increased. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on the lawyer without blinking. "So that was their plan. My client has been the sole administrator of her late husband's fortune and the family business. There is no evidence that Mr. Charles maintained any kind of relationship with Mrs. Margaret after their divorce." At that moment, Robert cleared his throat and stood up. "With all due respect, Your Honor, what Attorney Harrison has said is incorrect. There was no divorce." The judge raised an eyebrow and looked at Harrison. "Is that true?" The lawyer cleared his throat, but before he could respond, Robert pulled a document from his folder and slid it onto the court table. "Here we have irrefutable proof that Charles never legally finalized his divorce with Margaret. Not only that, but for years he hid this truth and manipulated legal records to protect his fortune." The judge took the document and reviewed it in silence. In the room, the tension was palpable. "This is a serious irregularity," murmured the judge. After a few minutes, Harrison stepped forward immediately. "Your Honor, even if the divorce wasn't officialized, Mr. Charles always acted as if his marriage to Patricia were legitimate." Robert smiled calmly. "The law is not based on how people act, but on what is written in official documents." Patricia clenched her fists. "That proves nothing." Robert pulled out another document. "Here I have more evidence. Financial movements showing that Charles transferred properties and accounts to third parties to prevent Margaret from claiming what was hers." The judge took the document and began reviewing it. The expression on his face changed. Harrison looked at Patricia sneakily. He knew the situation was getting complicated, but the worst was yet to come. Margaret leaned slightly toward the microphone in front of her. "Your Honor, I request that a key witness be called who can clarify this." The judge looked up. "What witness are we talking about?" "A former employee of Charles. Someone who was present during the fraudulent transactions and who can confirm that my husband manipulated documents to strip me of my assets." Patricia felt a chill. The judge nodded. "Very well. What is the witness's name?" Margaret took a breath and released it slowly before pronouncing the words that would make everyone in that room tremble. "Arthur." The silence that followed was sepulchral. At the defense table, Patricia felt the blood leave her face. "No," she whispered, barely audible. Tyler looked at her with confusion. "Who is that?" Patricia didn't answer. She just gritted her teeth. "Arthur, that man knew too much." The judge struck his gavel against the table. "Request accepted. The court will cite Arthur as a witness in the next hearing." Patricia felt like everything was crumbling around her, because if Arthur spoke, it would be the end. Patricia felt her blood freeze. Arthur, a man she had tried to erase from her memory, a man who knew too much. Sitting in her luxurious mansion, surrounded by designer furniture and expensive paintings, Patricia trembled with rage. She stood up abruptly and started pacing back and forth, trying to find a way out. If Arthur spoke, everything would collapse. Tyler and Chloe watched her in silence. They knew their mother was losing control, but they didn't understand why. "Mom, who is that man?" asked Chloe cautiously. Patricia stopped dead and looked at them coldly. "Someone who cannot open his mouth." Tyler frowned. "How much does he know?" Patricia gritted her teeth. "He knows enough to destroy us." Tyler felt a chill run down his spine. "Then we have to silence him." Chloe looked at him incredulously. "Do you hear what you're saying?" Tyler shrugged. "Mom is right. If that guy talks, it's over." Patricia took a deep breath and grabbed her phone. "We can't allow him to reach the court." She dialed a number furiously. "Harrison, find Arthur. Make him disappear." Meanwhile, at Mason's house, Margaret observed the folder of documents on her bed. Robert had left it in her hands with a warning. "These papers can destroy Patricia, but they will also bring consequences. Make sure you are ready." Margaret had no doubts. She had waited for this moment for more than 20 years. She took a deep breath and stored the documents in a safe place. The truth was about to come to light. But what she didn't know was that Patricia was already one step ahead. That same night, while the city slept, a man dressed in black approached a modest apartment on the outskirts of Richmond. He banged on the door forcefully. "Arthur, open up." The man inside felt a chill. He knew they would find him. When he opened the door, his face filled with terror. "You have to come with us. Now." Arthur swallowed hard. He knew if he went with them, he might never come back alive. But before he could react, he felt the cold of a gun on his back. "Don't do anything stupid, Arthur. It's a one-way trip." And at that moment, he knew his truth might die with him. The sound of the phone vibrating on the marble table made Patricia shudder. It was Harrison. She answered immediately, her voice tense and charged with desperation. "Tell me you resolved it." The lawyer sighed on the other end of the line. "We have a problem." Patricia straightened in her chair. "What happened?" "Arthur disappeared." The air became dense. "What do you mean he disappeared?" asked Patricia with the tone of someone about to lose patience. "When my contacts went to pick him up, his apartment was empty. There are no signs of him." Patricia gritted her teeth and punched the table. Imbeciles. How could they lose him? Someone must have warned him. Tyler, who had been listening to the conversation, crossed his arms. That means he's going to testify. Patricia stood up abruptly. We can't allow it. We don't have many options, Patricia, replied Harrison coldly. If he testifies, you will lose everything. The woman took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. Then we have to get ahead. How? Patricia smiled coldly. If we can't stop him from talking, we can make his words worthless. Meanwhile, at Mason's house, the atmosphere was also charged with tension. Scarlett paced back and forth in the master bedroom, biting her nails. Mason was sitting on the bed with his elbows on his knees and hands clasped. I can't believe my mother has gone this far, he murmured. Scarlett stopped and looked at him incredulously. Gone this far? Mason, don't you see what's happening? If we don't do something, we'll lose everything. Mason looked up, his expression hardened. Lose it, he repeated calmly. Since when is this fortune ours? Scarlett felt a chill. Since your father left it to us. Left it to us based on a lie, he replied with eyes fixed on her. For the first time, Scarlett felt she was losing Mason. He was starting to doubt. She approached slowly and sat next to him, taking his hand delicately. Love, she whispered. Don't let that woman manipulate you. But Mason pulled his hand away and stood up. I don't want to talk about this now. Scarlett felt a knot in her stomach. She had to do something before Mason sided completely with his mother, and she knew exactly how to do it. That same night, when Mason slept, Scarlett took her phone and dialed a number. I need you to get me information on Arthur, whatever the cost, because if Patricia failed to silence him, Scarlett would take charge of sinking him. Arthur felt the cold metal of the pistol against his back. His breathing became erratic as he raised his hands slowly. Don't do anything stupid, whispered a raspy voice behind him. The man swallowed hard. He knew if they put him in that black car waiting in front of his apartment, he wouldn't come out alive. Listen, he began to say with a trembling voice. I don't have to testify. I don't know anything. Tell that to the person who hired us. The thug pushed him forward. Arthur understood at that moment he was lost. But just when his captors were forcing him into the car, a patrol siren resonated in the street. The men exchanged looks and, without wasting time, released Arthur and scattered in different directions. Arthur fell to the ground panting. The officer got out of the car and ran toward him. Are you okay? He looked at him with desperation. They wanted to kill me. The police officer frowned. Do you know who they were? Arthur shook his head. But I do know who sent them. The officer helped him up. Come with me. This needs to be reported. Arthur felt a mixture of fear and relief. He still had a chance to speak. Meanwhile, in Patricia's mansion, the atmosphere was one of absolute tension. Harrison paced back and forth, pressing his phone against his ear. What do you mean they lost him? Patricia looked at him with a hardened face. Her hands trembled with rage. Useless, she whispered through her teeth. Tyler rubbed his temples. This is bad. Very bad. This is a disaster, corrected Patricia, glaring at Chloe, who had remained silent all this time. She spoke for the first time. If Arthur testifies, we are finished. Patricia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. He isn't going to testify. Harrison looked at her cautiously. What do you have in mind? Patricia smiled. We still have one last card. She took out her phone and dialed a number. Scarlett, we need to talk. Meanwhile, at Mason's house, Margaret prepared for the most important hearing of her life. She knew Arthur was her key witness, but what she didn't know was that someone was about to betray him. The early morning breeze blew strongly, moving the curtains of the room while Scarlett remained seated on the bed with her eyes glued to her phone screen. Her jaw was tight. Her fingers drummed against the device impatiently. She was waiting for an answer. She had made the call an hour earlier when Mason was already asleep, and she still had no news. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. She got up quietly, took a robe, and went out to the balcony. She dialed the number again and waited. I hope you have something good to tell me, she whispered. As soon as the call was answered, I have it, responded a male voice on the other side. But it won't be cheap. Scarlett gritted her teeth. Tell me what you found. The man laughed cynically. Arthur isn't exactly a saint. He has a history of fraud. He was involved in embezzlement when he worked for Charles. The most interesting part, there is an old bribery case where his name appears several times. Scarlett felt the air return to her lungs. Proof? I have it. Documents, bank files, and even an archived complaint that never went to trial. Send it all to me. You know how this works. First, the payment. Scarlett looked toward the balcony door, ensuring Mason was still asleep. Give me a few minutes. She ended the call and entered the room, walking on tiptoe to her purse. She took out a thick envelope with bills and put it in her robe. If Patricia had failed to get rid of Arthur, she would do it another way. With evidence of corruption against him, Arthur would be completely discredited. His testimony in the trial would be worth nothing. And without him, Margaret wouldn't have a case. Meanwhile, in a small hotel room on the outskirts of Richmond, Arthur observed his own reflection in the bathroom mirror. He had a tired face, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He knew he was in danger. The attempted kidnapping the night before had made it clear someone was desperate to silence him. But he had made his decision. He took an old brown envelope from his suitcase and held it tightly. There was the definitive proof against Charles. Tomorrow he would testify in court, and nothing would stop him. What Arthur didn't know was that at that same moment, Scarlett held his legal death sentence in her hands. Because when he took the stand, she would tear him to pieces. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, cameras, and curious onlookers filled the room waiting for the moment Arthur would testify against Charles. The case had taken on a media dimension, and Margaret, sitting next to Robert, knew that day would be decisive. To her right, she maintained a tense expression, nails dug into the table. Scarlett, on the other hand, had a barely perceptible smile. She knew something the others didn't. The judge struck his gavel against the table. We call witness Arthur to testify. The courtroom doors opened, and Arthur entered with cautious steps. His face reflected a mixture of fear and determination. He walked to the stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor stood up and walked slowly toward him. Mr. Arthur, you worked for Charles for several years. Could you tell us what you knew about his financial transactions? Arthur nodded and cleared his throat. Charles committed fraud for years. He moved money from his company to personal accounts and used front men to hide assets that legally belonged to his wife, Margaret. The murmurs began to spread through the room. Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. She had done it. The truth was coming to light. But then Harrison, Patricia's lawyer, stood up with a sharp smile. With the court's permission, he said, walking calmly toward the stand. Mr. Arthur, is it true that in the past you were accused of fraud and bribery? Arthur tensed. That has nothing to do with. Answer the question, interrupted Harrison. Arthur swallowed hard. Yes, but. The murmurs in the room became louder. Harrison turned to the judge. Your Honor, we want to present evidence that Mr. Arthur has been involved in illicit activities and that his testimony is unreliable. An aide approached and placed a folder on the judge's table. Margaret felt a chill. She glanced sideways at Scarlett, who could barely contain her satisfaction. Everything was a trap. The judge scanned the documents and looked up. The court will take a recess to analyze this information. He struck his gavel. The room erupted in chaos. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She knew this wasn't over, but she also knew her case was now in danger, because if they discredited Arthur, she lost the only proof she had to recover what was hers. It is heartbreaking to watch the truth get buried by dirty tactics, just when victory seemed so close. But don't lose hope for Margaret yet. Sometimes, the most powerful testimony comes from the person you least expect. Stay tuned to see who steps up next. The court remained submerged in a tense murmur after the revelation that Arthur had a history of fraud and bribery. Harrison adjusted his shirt cuffs with a triumphant air, while Patricia maintained a barely contained smile. Margaret, for her part, remained in her seat with her gaze fixed on the stand. She didn't flinch. She showed no desperation. She still had cards to play. The judge struck the gavel against the table. The court will take this new information into account. Mr. Arthur, you may step down. Arthur stood up sweating. He looked at Margaret with a mixture of shame and fear. He had tried to help her, but now everything he said would lack value. When he left the room, the judge addressed Robert. Do you have more evidence to support your case? Robert cleared his throat and nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We want to call Mason to testify. Scarlett's eyes widened with panic. What? Mason, who until that moment had been silent, looked up surprised. Me? Margaret looked at him firmly. Son, it's time you decide whose side you are on. The judge gestured to the court officers. Mason, take the stand. Scarlett grabbed her husband's arm with desperation. Mason, you don't have to do this. He pulled his arm away gently but with determination. Yes, I have to do it. He stood up and walked to the stand. He took a deep breath before sitting down and swearing to tell the truth. The prosecutor approached. Mr. Mason, you are the son of Charles and Margaret, correct? Yes. Did you know your father never legally finalized his divorce with your mother? Mason swallowed hard. No, until my mother told me. Scarlett watched with lips pressed tight. She couldn't allow Mason to side with her. Mr. Mason, do you believe your mother has the right to claim her inheritance? The room went silent, but Mason wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at Margaret. For the first time in years, the veil of his wife's influence lifted, and he saw the woman before him, the gray hair, the calloused hands from scrubbing his floors, the quiet strength that had survived his own neglect. He saw his mother. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sadness, but of a shattering realization. It's not about the inheritance, Mason said, his voice trembling with emotion. It's about dignity. I watched this woman serve me in silence while I let her be treated like a stranger in my home. I forgot who she was. He turned to face the jury, his voice hardening. Yes, she has the right. Not because of a piece of paper, but because she is the only person in this entire family who has remained true. Patricia and Scarlett built a life on appearances. My mother built hers on endurance. The camera flashes exploded. Patricia stood up with fury. This is a betrayal. The judge struck the table. Order in the court. Scarlett could barely breathe. Everything was crumbling, but she wasn't going to give up. Not yet. She turned to Harrison and whispered with a cruel smile, "We still have one last resource, because if Mason betrayed her, she would drag him down with her to the end." The courtroom was in complete silence. The tension of the final moments of a confrontation that had lasted too long was felt in the air. Margaret remained sitting with her back straight, hands clasped on her lap. Across from her, Scarlett kept her jaw tight, knuckles white from pressing the edge of the table. Patricia, sunken in her seat, could barely breathe. The judge reviewed the documents for the last time before looking up at the room. After analyzing all the evidence presented and hearing the testimonies of both parties, his voice resonated with authority. The court has reached a final decision. A murmur ran through the room. Mason, sitting next to his mother, felt his heart accelerate. Scarlett didn't look away from the judge, clinging to the hope that there could still be a miracle in her favor. It is recognized that Margaret was a victim of fraud and dispossession of assets by Mr. Charles. Patricia closed her eyes with desperation. Consequently, this court declares null the transfer of properties and bank accounts made under his name and that of his children. Everything must be returned to the legitimate owner within a period of 30 days. An outburst of murmurs shook the room. Margaret exhaled with her eyes closed. She had done it. After more than 20 years, justice finally belonged to her, but not everyone was willing to accept defeat. Patricia stood up abruptly, hitting the table with her hands. "This is an injustice." The judge glared at her. "Mrs. Patricia, if you do not keep your composure, I will have you removed from this room." Patricia breathed with difficulty. She looked at her lawyer Harrison, seeking support, but he just shook his head. There was nothing more to do. Scarlett, however, remained in complete silence. Her gaze was fixed on the void. Her thoughts were racing at 1,000 miles per hour. She hadn't lost everything yet. There was one last card to play. The judge struck the gavel for the last time. Case closed. The camera flashes illuminated the room as the news spread like wildfire. Margaret had won. Mason took his mother's hand and squeezed it with pride. "You deserve it," he whispered. Margaret just smiled, but on the other side of the room, Scarlett left in silence. She walked without looking at anyone, her expression cold and calculating, because in her mind, a new plan had already formed. If the court didn't favor her, she would take care of getting revenge another way. Patricia's mansion was in complete silence. Only the echo of her heels resonated on the marble floor as she walked through the halls with hurried steps. The suitcases were ready. The last remnants of her life of luxury and appearances were being packed without order or delicacy. Tyler and Chloe observed their mother with somber expressions. "Are we really going to run away like cowards?" asked Tyler with a frown. Patricia stopped and looked at him coldly. "This isn't running away. It's a strategic retreat." "That sounds exactly like running away," intervened Chloe, crossing her arms. Patricia gritted her teeth and exhaled impatiently. "What do you want me to do? Stay here and watch how they take everything from me? Let that old woman sit in my house and claim my money?" Tyler snorted. "That money was never yours, Mom." Patricia felt a chill run down her back. "I don't want to hear those words again in this house." She snapped with a voice sharp as a razor. "We are leaving tonight. And where to?" asked Chloe with a mixture of rage and desperation. "We have nothing. We don't have houses. We don't have bank accounts. We have nowhere to go." "I have contacts," murmured Patricia, looking away. Tyler let out a sarcastic laugh. "You mean the same contacts who tried to stop the trial and failed?" Patricia pressed her lips together with fury. "I don't need you to question me now. Just do what I tell you." The siblings looked at each other, and for the first time, Chloe felt something she had never experienced before: shame for her mother. Patricia's fall had been resounding, but she still didn't accept it. When night fell over Richmond, a black car parked in front of the mansion. A tall man with an inscrutable expression got out of the vehicle and opened the back door. Patricia came out with her dark glasses, her designer coat, and her last vestige of dignity. Before getting into the car, she turned and looked at the house. Her house, the house she had built with lies, the house that now belonged to Margaret. She closed her eyes and clenched her fists. This wasn't ending here. She turned, got into the car, and slammed the door. The engine roared, and the vehicle disappeared into the night. But what Patricia didn't know was that her flight would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would change everyone's life, because someone else was waiting for their moment to attack. And her name was Scarlett. The echo of Scarlett's footsteps resonated in the solitary street as she walked aimlessly. The night breeze was cold, but not colder than the feeling of emptiness growing inside her. She had lost everything. Hours earlier, she had left the courtroom with her head held high, not allowing anyone to see her desperation. But now, every step brought her closer to a reality she had never contemplated. She was nobody anymore. When she arrived at the house she had shared with Mason for years, she found the door ajar. Pushing it open, the light from the living room illuminated the face of her husband, who was waiting for her with a suitcase beside him. Scarlett felt a chill run down her spine. "What does this mean?" Mason stood up slowly. His dark eyes reflected determination. "It means you have to leave." Scarlett felt like she was running out of air. "You can't do this to me." "It's already decided," replied Mason with a firm voice. "I can't continue with someone who has spent years manipulating me, lying to me, and humiliating my mother." Scarlett's lips trembled. "I love you." Mason shook his head. "No, Scarlett, you don't love anyone. You only love power and control." The silence became heavy. Scarlett looked at the suitcase and then looked back at Mason. "I have nowhere to go." Mason crossed his arms. "That's not my problem." The words were a dagger. For years she had controlled everything in that house, in her marriage, in Mason's life, and now he was throwing her out as if she were a stranger. With trembling hands, she took the suitcase and headed to the door. But before leaving, she turned one last time. "You're going to regret this." Mason didn't answer. Scarlett went out into the street, and the door closed behind her with a sound that marked the end of her life as she knew it. But as she walked through the empty streets, an idea began to take shape in her mind. If Mason and Margaret thought her story with them was over, they were very wrong. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee permeated the luxurious office in downtown Richmond. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, illuminating the mahogany furniture and shelves full of documents. Margaret was sitting behind a desk that decades ago had been hers. Now, after more than 20 years, everything was back in her hands. Robert observed her from the other side of the desk with a smile of satisfaction. How does it feel to be back? Margaret scanned every corner of the office, remembering the days when her presence commanded respect in the company she herself had built alongside Charles. I don't feel back, Robert. I feel like I should never have left. Robert nodded. And now that you've recovered everything, what's next? Margaret took a document and slid it across the table. I'm going to make changes in the company. I want to clean every trace of corruption. I want to fire those who helped Charles hide his fraud, and I want to make sure this never happens again. Robert smiled. That is how a true leader should speak. But before he could say anything else, the office door burst open. Mason entered with a tense expression. Mom, you have to see this. He placed his phone on the table, and Margaret narrowed her eyes, reading the headline of the news appearing on the screen. Charles's ex-wife recovers her fortune, but scandal from the past could sink her again. Robert frowned. What is this about? Mason swiped his finger across the screen and opened the article. Someone has been leaking information about alleged irregularities in the inheritance documents. They are insinuating that the restitution of assets could have been illegal. Margaret felt a chill. This has Scarlett's stamp on it. Mason closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a pang of shame. He had shared his life with that woman without realizing what kind of person she really was. We can't ignore this, said Robert seriously. If the press starts questioning the court's ruling, they could open a new investigation. Margaret took a breath and stood up calmly. Then I will have to handle this personally. Mason looked at her with concern. Mom, what do you plan to do? Margaret took her purse and walked toward the door. I'm going to talk to the only person who has the power to stop this before it's too late. Robert stood up immediately. Patricia? Margaret shook her head. I'm going to see Scarlett. The silence in the office was absolute. Mason felt a chill. Mom, Scarlett isn't going to give up easily. Margaret gave him a firm look. I know, son, but neither am I. She left the office with a sure step, not looking back, because if Scarlett wanted to play dirty, she was ready to show her that this time she wasn't going to allow herself to be trampled on ever again. The sound of the coffee maker dripping was the only thing breaking the silence in the kitchen of the small apartment where Scarlett now lived. The place was far from the luxury she was used to. Bare walls, cheap furniture, and a refrigerator that barely worked. She looked at her reflection in the window with a bitter grimace. Nothing remained of the haughty and powerful woman she had been. Every day was a struggle to survive. Without Mason's money, without his last name, and without her social position, she had fallen into oblivion. Her friends stopped answering her calls, and doors that once opened with a smile now closed without a single word. She adjusted the tattered sweater she was wearing and sighed. She couldn't go on like this. The doorbell rang, and she hurried to open the door. A woman in a maid's uniform was waiting for her with a folder in her hand. Mrs. Scarlett? She said professionally. You can sign here. Scarlett frowned and took the document. She read it quickly, feeling shame cover her like a heavy blanket. It was a job offer as a domestic worker. It can't be, she whispered, squeezing the paper between her fingers. Her pride screamed at her to tear it up, to reject it. But her empty stomach and the overdue rent bill reminded her of reality. Trembling, she took the pen and signed. The woman smiled kindly. You start tomorrow. Don't be late. Scarlett closed the door with a slam and collapsed into the nearest chair. She had fallen so low that now she had to do the same job she had so despised in Margaret. And the worst part was that she still didn't know who she was going to work for. But she would find out very soon, because her new boss would be the last person she expected to see. Scarlett arrived at the indicated location without knowing what awaited her. She walked with her chin held high, trying to ignore the fact that her clothes were worn and that every step she took distanced her further from the life she had before. She took a deep breath and stopped in front of the imposing house. The black iron gate and the enormous windows seemed familiar, but she refused to accept it. She rang the doorbell with impatient knuckles. A woman in a service uniform opened the door. "Scarlett?" "Yes," she responded impatiently. "I was told this is where I start working." The woman nodded and let her in. When Scarlett entered, she felt the air leave her lungs. She knew this house. The furniture, the curtains, the marble floor. It was the mansion that had belonged to Charles. But now, every corner bore the stamp of Margaret. Her stomach turned. It couldn't be. Not here. Not like this. The woman guided her down a hallway until reaching an elegant living room where Margaret was waiting for her, sitting in a dark leather armchair with a cup of tea in her hand. When their eyes met, Scarlett felt the world crashing down on her. Talk about poetic justice. Seeing the tables turn so completely is satisfying, isn't it? But Margaret's reaction here proves that true class can't be bought. You won't believe what she asks Scarlett to do next. It's a lesson in humanity you have to hear. "Welcome," said Margaret with absolute calm. "I see you accepted the job." Scarlett felt the burn of humiliation rise in her chest. To serve the woman she had mocked? To wear the uniform she had forced Margaret to wear? Her hands trembled as she gripped the tray. Is this your revenge?" she spat out, though her voice lacked its old venom. Margaret placed her teacup down with a soft clink. She looked at Scarlett not with hatred, but with a calm, piercing wisdom. "Revenge would be leaving you on the street, Scarlett. That is what you would have done to me." Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden she had reclaimed. "This isn't revenge. It is an education. You spent years believing that power comes from looking down on people. Now, you will learn that true dignity comes from honest work. I am giving you the one thing you never gave me, a chance to find your humanity." Scarlett felt the employees' gazes on her, waiting for her reaction. She knew if she left, she had nowhere to go. If she stayed, she would have to obey the woman she had humiliated so much. She took a deep breath, swallowing her pride. "When do I start?" Margaret's lips curved into a slight smile. "Today, because the lesson is just beginning." The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the marble floor of the mansion. Scarlett walked with heavy steps, feeling every gaze on her. She knew the employees recognized her. They knew who she was. They knew what she had done. Margaret's orders were clear. She would have to clean every corner of the house, serve the food, and ensure everything was impeccable. The same work she had despised all her life. The first day was hell. "Mrs. Scarlett, could you bring me a little more coffee?" asked Margaret with her serene and paused tone. Scarlett swallowed her pride and nodded. She walked to the kitchen, clenching her fists every time she heard her mother-in-law's voice giving her orders. Her rage grew, but she had no other option. Over time, the days became weeks, and Scarlett began to notice something strange. Despite her humiliating situation, Margaret never made fun of her. She never humiliated her in front of the other employees. She never returned the hatred she herself had given her for years. That infuriated her even more. One afternoon, while cleaning the windows, Scarlett heard footsteps behind her. "You can leave that now." She recognized the voice instantly. She turned slowly and found Margaret standing in the doorway with a serene expression. "What?" asked Scarlett, frowning. "You don't have to keep being here," said Margaret. "You can go." Scarlett felt a pang in her chest. "Are you firing me? I'm giving you a chance to start over." The silence between them was dense. Margaret took a step forward. "I don't want you to spend the rest of your life as a shadow of what you were. I don't want you to live with hate in your heart." Scarlett felt her breathing accelerate. How could she forgive her? "Why are you doing this?" she asked with a trembling voice. "I humiliated you. I treated you like trash." "And now you know how it feels," replied Margaret with tranquility. Scarlett felt something break inside her. For years she had built her life on contempt, arrogance, and resentment. Now, everything she had despised was the only thing she had. "You don't have to accept it now," continued Margaret. "But someday you will understand that true power is not in humiliating others, but in knowing when it is time to let them go." Scarlett bit her lips, holding back tears. "I don't want your pity." "It is not pity," replied Margaret. "It is justice. Scarlett didn't answer. She took her few belongings and left the house without looking back. She didn't know what she would do, where she would go, or how she would start over. But for the first time in her life, she felt free from the weight of her own hatred. Margaret observed the mansion that was now hers for the last time from the large window of the study. She saw the perfectly manicured gardens, the stone fountain in the center, and the huge iron gate at the main entrance. Everything that was once taken from her was back in her hands. She took a deep breath. It had taken more than 20 years to reach this moment. Behind her, Robert watched her with a slight smile. "And now what's next, Margaret?" She turned slowly and held his gaze. Moving forward, Robert nodded with approval. "You've proven that justice can take time, but it arrives." Margaret smiled with melancholy. "It's not just about justice, Robert. It's about recovering who I am. For years they made me believe I was worth nothing, that I was a burden, that my life was over. But today I am here, standing with my head high." Robert crossed his arms and sighed. "Patricia is out of the country, no one knows where. And Scarlett, well, I think destiny already took care of giving her her punishment." Margaret lowered her gaze for a moment. She thought of Scarlett, of the proud woman who had despised and humiliated her for years. Now, after everything, she had had the opportunity to take revenge. But she didn't, because Scarlett's true punishment wasn't poverty, but loneliness. "There is nothing more to do with them," she murmured. "They already took their path." Robert leaned slightly toward her. "And Mason?" Margaret smiled tenderly. "He's learning to live without Scarlett's shadow. I'm glad to see him grow, to be the man I always wanted him to be." Robert let out a slight laugh. "I think, after all, you achieved more than recovering your fortune. You recovered your life." Margaret looked at him and nodded. "Yes, Robert, I recovered it." And with that certainty, she left the study, walking through the corridors of the house that was once her prison and was now her symbol of victory. When she crossed the main door and felt the warm sun on her face, she smiled with serenity. Her story of suffering had ended. Now, all that remained was to live. The afternoon sun fell heavily on Richmond when Margaret crossed the doors of her company. Despite the warm breeze, her expression remained firm, impenetrable. Months had passed since she had recovered her fortune, but her struggle was not over yet. The employees greeted her with respect, seeing her walk through the halls. Many of them remembered her from her times as owner, when her leadership was synonymous with success. Others, however, observed her with caution, knowing that her return would bring inevitable changes. When she entered the boardroom, she found Robert waiting for her with a serious expression. In front of him, resting on the mahogany table, were several open folders with documents he had been reviewing. "You're not going to believe what we've found," he said without preamble, sliding a thick folder toward her. Margaret took the documents and began to read. Her eyes moved quickly, analyzing every figure, every contract, every name that appeared printed on the sheets. Embezzlement, inflated contracts, transfers to unknown accounts. "This is huge," she murmured, frowning. "Charles didn't just steal from me, Robert. He also turned this company into his piggy bank." Robert nodded gravely. "This isn't everything." Margaret raised her gaze slowly. "What else?" Robert took another folder, this time with a different cover. He slid it toward her and clasped his fingers on the table. "We don't know how many partners Charles had outside the official records, but there is one in particular who is causing us problems." Margaret opened the folder and saw the name heading the documents. Frank. The letters seemed to weigh on the sheet. "Who is this man?" Robert sighed and took out an envelope with several photographs, an old associate of Charles. "He doesn't appear in any official company document, but we know they moved money together. Hidden investments, shady deals. There are rumors that Charles owed him a large amount of money." Margaret observed the photos. In one of them, taken in what appeared to be a luxury dinner, Charles was sitting next to a tall, robust man with slicked back hair and a calculating smile. "How do we know he really owes him money?" she asked, maintaining calm. Robert handed her a signed sheet. Because Charles left this promissory note, Margaret read the letter carefully. In it, Charles committed to paying Frank an exorbitant amount of money, but he never did. Her jaw tightened. And now he wants me to pay him? Robert nodded slowly. Frank knows Charles's fortune is now yours, and he is determined to recover what he considers his. Silence became dense in the room. Margaret took a deep breath and left the papers on the table carefully. I want to meet with him. Robert looked at her cautiously. Margaret, this man is not a simple businessman. It is said he has deals with organized crime. He isn't someone you can negotiate with like you did in court. I don't care what is said about him. If he wants to talk about money, I will do it on my own turf. Robert rubbed his forehead. Are you sure about this? More than ever. Robert observed her in silence. For years he had seen Margaret endure injustice after injustice, but he had never seen her so determined. Finally, he sighed and took out his phone. I'll make the arrangements. Margaret stood up and walked toward the window. She observed the city extending before her, the blinking lights of the buildings, the life continuing beyond her problems. She had fought to recover what belonged to her. She had defeated Charles even after his death. But now a new enemy was in her path, and this time the danger was real. The clock marked 8 p.m. when Margaret entered her study with a firm step. She sat behind the desk, feeling for the first time in years that that place belonged to her. She had recovered her company, her house, her legacy. But the battle wasn't over yet. In front of her, Robert left a thick envelope on the table. We got this a few hours ago. Margaret opened the envelope and took out several documents. Her eyes narrowed upon seeing the contents: financial reports, bank transfer records, and contracts signed by Charles. What is this? Robert sighed. Proof that Charles was involved in business with very dangerous people. Margaret felt a chill. Who are we talking about? Robert took out a photograph and slid it across the table. Margaret took it carefully, and her expression hardened. It was the image of a man about 50 years old, with graying hair, cold eyes, and a calculating smile. His name is Frank, explained Robert. He was Charles's partner in several hidden businesses, money laundering operations and influence peddling. No one spoke of him in public, but everyone knew he was someone you shouldn't cross. Margaret left the photo on the table. And what does he want from me? Robert pulled out another document. He says Charles owed him a large amount of money. Now that you inherited everything, he wants you to pay the debt. Margaret pressed her lips together. How much? Robert looked at her gravely. $10 million. Silence fell like a slab. Margaret leaned back in her seat. That's an absurd amount. It is, confirmed Robert. But this man is not governed by what is fair. He wants to recover what he believes belongs to him, and if he doesn't get it, he won't stop at anything. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on the papers. For years, Charles had humiliated her, stripped her of her life, and condemned her to poverty. And now, even after death, he remained a shadow in her life. She took a deep breath and straightened up. I want to see him. Robert looked at her incredulously. Margaret, this man is dangerous. He isn't like Patricia or Scarlett. If you confront him, he has the means to hurt you. I don't care, she replied firmly. I am not going to yield to another man who thinks he can steal what is mine. Robert studied her for a moment and then nodded with resignation. I'll make the arrangements. Margaret took the documents and stacked them carefully. Tell him I'm ready to listen. What she didn't know was that at that moment, Frank was also preparing for the meeting, and in his mind, Margaret had no choice but to pay. Scarlett walked through the streets of Richmond with her face covered by a veil of rage and frustration. She clenched her fists inside the pockets of her cheap coat, while her mind boiled with dark thoughts. From the moment Margaret had fired her, she had wandered from one place to another without direction or purpose, facing the crude reality of her fall. She was staying in a tiny room, rented by the week in a seedy boarding house, with peeling walls and a mattress that smelled of humidity. She, the woman who one day strolled through the most exclusive shops, now had to count every penny to be able to eat. But Scarlett had never been one to accept defeat. She stopped in front of a neighborhood cafe and went inside, seeking refuge from the night wind. She ordered a cheap coffee and sat in the most secluded corner of the place. She took out her phone and looked at the locked screen. There were no messages. No one was looking for her. No one needed her. She took a deep breath and slid her finger down the contact list until finding a name she hadn't seen for months. Mason. Her thumb hovered over the option to call, but she stopped. She couldn't contact him just like that. Not when she knew he still despised her. But there was a way to re-enter his life. She had to make him feel guilty. She ran a hand through her hair, disheveling it slightly to give herself a more neglected look. Then she took a small mirror from her purse and looked at herself. Yes, she had the perfect look of a defeated, abandoned, vulnerable woman. She put the mirror away and with a broken sigh, finally pressed the button to dial Mason's number. The call rang several times before he answered. "Scarlett?" His voice sounded cautious, distant. She swallowed hard and let out a slight sob. "Mason." There was silence on the other end of the line. "What do you want?" Scarlett let her voice break. "I don't know who else to turn to. I have no one." Another silence. "It was good." Mason was doubting. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, but his tone wasn't as firm as before. Scarlett clung to the opportunity. "I don't want money, Mason. I just wanted to hear you." Mason sighed. "I don't know if it's a good idea to talk. Please." Scarlett pressed her fingers against her forehead, feeling a slight dizziness from anxiety. "Just a chance to explain myself. So you understand what happened." Mason didn't answer immediately. "I'll think about it." And he hung up. Scarlett left the phone on the table and closed her eyes. The seed was planted. If she played her cards right, Mason would return to her side. And when that happened, she would have access to the life that was snatched from her again. The sound of raindrops hitting the window glass filled Margaret's office. Sitting at her desk, she reviewed documents with a frown. She had spent weeks reorganizing the company, making sure to eliminate anyone who had been involved in Charles's frauds. But the biggest problem wasn't inside the company, but outside. Robert entered the office without knocking, with an envelope in his hand and a tense face. "Margaret, we have a problem." She looked up, putting the papers aside. "Tell me." Robert dropped the envelope on the table. Margaret took it, and upon opening it, found photographs. Images of her entering and leaving her company, dining at a restaurant, walking down the street. "They are watching you," said Robert in a low voice. Margaret felt a chill but showed no fear. "Who?" Robert crossed his arms. "Frank." The name floated in the air like a poison. "Are you sure?" Robert nodded. "Not only is he watching you, but he is also spreading rumors that Charles owed him money and that you are avoiding paying him." Margaret took a deep breath. "Let him talk." "I'm not afraid of that man." Robert leaned forward. "He's not just a talker, Margaret. Frank has connections with dangerous people. If we don't pay him, he will take more aggressive measures." Margaret closed the envelope and left it on the table. "Then I better face him." Robert looked at her incredulously. "You can't be serious." "I am very serious. Robert, I am not going to let a man like him make me back down after everything I fought to recover what was mine." Robert rubbed his face with frustration. "Okay, I'll get a meeting with him." "But Margaret, this man plays dirty." She looked at him firmly. "Then I'll play harder." That night, while the storm fell over the city, Margaret looked at her reflection in the window. She knew Frank wouldn't stop. It was time to put a stop to him before it was too late. The sound of cutlery clinking against porcelain was the only thing breaking the silence in the mansion's dining room. Margaret dined in the company of Mason and Robert. The conversation had been quiet, without mentioning Frank's threat, but the atmosphere had an unusual weight. Margaret left her wineglass on the table and looked at Robert. "Could you find out anything more about Frank?" Robert sighed and cleaned his glasses with a handkerchief before answering. "I spoke with some contacts. Frank isn't just an aggressive businessman. He is related to shady operations in several countries. If Charles owed him money, it is likely that money came from illicit businesses." Mason frowned. "And what does that mean for us?" Robert rested his elbows on the table and clasped his fingers. "It means Frank doesn't just want his share. He wants to make sure no one else can discover what Charles did with his money. And if that means getting rid of those who might be a problem, he won't hesitate to do it." Margaret pressed her lips together. "That explains why he has been sending people to watch me." Mason looked at her surprised. "What?" They've been following you? Margaret nodded calmly. It's nothing I didn't expect. But Frank is making a mistake if he thinks I'm going to yield to his threats. Robert watched her with concern. Margaret, this man is not like Patricia or Scarlett. He doesn't play in courts. He doesn't use lawyers. I know, she replied coldly. And that's why I want to see him in person. Mason hit the table with frustration. You can't do that. This man is dangerous. Margaret gave him a serene look. Son, after everything I went through, do you really think I'm going to sit with my arms crossed? Silence became heavy. Robert sighed and nodded. Fine, I'll organize the meeting. Mason ran a hand over his face, visibly worried. Just promise me you won't do anything risky. Margaret smiled tenderly at him. Son, everything I have done in my life has been a risk, but this time I have no intention of losing. That same night, Robert made the necessary calls to arrange the meeting. Frank accepted, and while the city slept, in a dark office in Richmond, a man in a black suit lit a cigar while reviewing some documents. On the cover of the folder in front of him was a single name written in large letters, Margaret. Frank exhaled the smoke slowly and smiled. Let's see how brave you are in person, Mrs. Margaret, because if she thought she could face him without paying a price, she was very wrong. Night was falling over Richmond when Scarlett crossed the door of the restaurant where she had agreed to meet Mason. She wore a simple but elegant dress, enough to make him believe that despite her misfortune, she still retained some dignity. Days had passed since she called him begging to see him, and although at first he was reluctant, he finally accepted. Not because he wanted to get back with her, but because despite everything, there was still some compassion left in his heart. Mason was already sitting at a table near the window. His posture was rigid, his expression serious. Scarlett took a deep breath and approached, forcing herself to smile sweetly. Thanks for coming, she said, sitting in front of him. Mason stared at her. You said you needed to talk. Here I am. Scarlett looked down, feigning nervousness. I don't even know where to start, she whispered. Everything that happened between us. I ruined it, and I know it. Mason crossed his arms. Yes, you ruined it. She let out a trembling sigh. Mason, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want you to listen. I lost everything. I'm in ruins. I have no one. And that was a consequence of your decisions. Scarlett looked up quickly. I didn't want it to end like this. I didn't want us to lose everything. Mason shook his head. We didn't lose it. You lost it. The blow was accurate, but Scarlett wouldn't let herself be defeated so easily. She leaned slightly toward him with eyes shining with a calculated emotion. But I still have something left, Mason. Something that maybe can help us recover what we had. He frowned. What are you talking about? Scarlett took an envelope from her purse and placed it on the table. Inside here is information about an alternate will Charles left. A document that could change everything. Mason stared at her. And what do you want from me? Scarlett took a breath. If we work together, we could use it to recover part of the fortune. The silence prolonged. Finally, Mason shook his head. I am not going to betray my mother for you. Scarlett felt control slipping from her hands. Mason, think about it well. He stood up and took the envelope. I'm going to check this. If it's real, it doesn't mean I'll use it in your favor. Scarlett swallowed hard, knowing the plan hadn't gone as expected. She watched him leave the restaurant and felt a chill run down her spine. Because if Mason discovered the truth behind that will, her last chance to return to the top would crumble. The night covered Richmond with a mantle of distant lights and elongated shadows when Robert arrived at Margaret's mansion. His face was serious, tenser than usual, and his steps resonated with haste on the marble floor. Margaret was waiting for him in her study, reviewing company documents. She barely looked up when he entered, but as soon as she saw his expression, she put everything aside. Robert, what's wrong? He closed the door behind him and took a thick envelope from inside his jacket. He left it on the table with a firm movement. I found something that changes everything. Margaret frowned and took the envelope. Her hands, which had trembled many times in the past out of fear or helplessness, were now steady. She took out the papers and read them in silence. Every line she scanned was like a direct blow to the stomach. It was a will. one that Charles had left in secret. But the most shocking part wasn't its existence, but its content. The document, dated a few months before his death, named an unexpected heir. Not Patricia, not her children, not Margaret, but someone else. Margaret looked up slowly, her dark eyes reflecting a storm. "Is this real?" Robert nodded gravely. "I checked its authenticity. It is legitimate. Charles left a part of his fortune to a person he never mentioned in life." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Who?" Robert handed her another document. "The heir is named Julian. He is 30 years old. He lives in Norfolk. According to my contacts, he doesn't know this will exist yet." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. "But sooner or later he will discover it." Robert nodded. "And when that happens, he will come for what he believes belongs to him." Margaret left the papers on the table calmly. "Then I will have to find him before my enemies do." Robert looked at her with concern. "Margaret, this can complicate everything. If this man decides to fight, he could open a new legal process. And I'm not going to wait for that to happen," she interrupted with a firm voice. "I'm going to see him with my own eyes." Robert sighed. "I'll make the necessary calls to locate him." Margaret stood up and walked to the window, observing the reflection of her own face in the glass. Her whole life had been a battle, and when she thought she could finally live in peace, Charles's past returned to haunt her. But this time, she was ready to face it. The sound of typewriter keys resonated in Robert's office. The documents of Charles's alternate will were spread out on the table, each sheet detailing a possible twist that could change everything. Margaret observed the papers in silence, feeling the weight of her past once again on her shoulders. She had spent weeks facing Frank and his veiled threats, defending her company and her honor with the same determination with which she had recovered her fortune. But now, when she thought nothing more could surprise her, Charles's will appeared like a shadow of what she never finished knowing about her ex-husband. Robert left a pen on the table and massaged his temples with his fingers. "If this document reaches the courts, it could invalidate the entire previous ruling," he said gravely. "And if that happens, you would lose a significant part of your fortune." Margaret remained silent for a moment, scanning every line of the document. Charles had been meticulous, even in death. "Does Julian already know he is an heir?" Robert shook his head. "For now, no. But Scarlett and Frank know. If they manage to contact him before us, they can manipulate him to file a lawsuit." Margaret leaned back in her chair and clasped her fingers. She knew the battle wasn't over yet. "I have to talk to him." Robert looked at her incredulously. "Are you sure?" "I'm not going to let history repeat itself, Robert. I am not going to allow another Charles to snatch what is mine." Robert exhaled and nodded. "Then we will find him before them." But while Margaret and Robert planned their next move, Scarlett was acting out of pure desperation. Using the last of her pawned jewelry money to travel, she was already one step ahead. In a discreet cafeteria in Norfolk, Scarlett held a cup of coffee while observing Julian with a charming smile. The 30-year-old man, dark hair and a shrewd look, studied her with distrust. "Why should I believe I am Charles's heir?" Scarlett clasped her hands on the table. "Because I have the proof." Julian took the envelope she slid across the table and opened it. His expression hardened upon reading the document. "If this is true, it means I have a right to everything that is now in Margaret's hands." Scarlett nodded slowly. "And Frank can help you get it." Julian looked up. "And why are you helping me?" Scarlett smiled. "Let's say we both have scores to settle with that woman." Julian left the document on the table and looked at her intently. "Then let's make sure she loses everything." Just when peace seemed within reach, greed rears its ugly head again with one final scheme. It seems Margaret's battles aren't quite over, but this time, she is sharper and stronger than ever. Let's see how she handles this final attack on her legacy, because if Margaret thought her war was over, she was about to discover that her greatest battle was just beginning. The courtroom was in complete silence. The tension was so dense it seemed it could be cut with a knife. Margaret remained seated with her back straight, observing the stand with a calm that only true victors could afford. Beside her, Robert reviewed the final documents, his expression imperturbable, but his hands showed the pressure of the moment. On the other side of the room, Scarlett and Julian stood next to their lawyers. Julian looked confident, with a slight smile of superiority on his lips, convinced he had the advantage. He had believed that with the alternate will, everything would change in his favor. Scarlett, on the other hand, was not smiling. Her face was tense, her eyes desperately searching for some glimmer of hope in the situation. She knew this was her last chance to recover power, and if she failed, there would be no return. The judge struck his gavel against the table. Let us proceed with the final presentation of evidence before the final ruling. Robert stood up with the assurance of a man who held the master play in his hand. Your Honor, we bring irrefutable proof that this alternate will presented by Mr. Julian is false. A murmur spread through the room. Julian frowned, and his lawyer stood up immediately. That is a baseless slander. Robert smiled calmly and pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase. Here we have a forensic analysis of Charles's signature on this document. He paused, letting the words take effect. And it has been proven that it was forged. The scandal erupted in the room. Camera flashes illuminated the tense faces of those involved. Your Honor, furthermore, we have the testimony of a notary who confirms that Charles never signed this will. Julian's lawyers tried to protest, but the judge raised his hand to silence them. Where is that witness? The courtroom door opened, and an older man in a gray suit and thick glasses entered with a sure step. My name is Mr. Davis. I was Charles's trusted notary for over 20 years. Never in all that time was there mention of an alternate will. Julian felt a knot form in his throat. Scarlett beside him felt everything crumbling. The judge scanned the documents with a severe expression. Based on this new evidence, the court declares the alternate will presented by Mr. Julian null and void. The thunder in the room was immediate. Julian hit the table with fury. His lawyers tried to refute, but they knew there was nothing more to do. Scarlett, on the other hand, didn't react. She just stood there with a vacant stare, watching her last card burn before her eyes. The judge struck his gavel again. Given that the validity of the alternate will has been discarded, the ruling in favor of Margaret stands. The case is closed. The words rumbled like a death sentence for Scarlett. Mason, who had observed everything in silence, got up and left without even looking at his ex-wife. There was nothing more to say. Margaret closed her eyes for an instant. She had won. Definitely, this time she had won. But before she could enjoy her victory, she knew she had to do something. She stood up, walked slowly to where Scarlett was still sitting, paralyzed, and looked her directly in the eyes. It's over. Scarlett looked at her with eyes full of rage and desperation, but said nothing. You dug your own grave, whispered Margaret, and now you will have to live with that. Without saying more, she turned and left the court with her head high, leaving behind the past and those who tried to destroy her. But as she walked away, Scarlett felt something she had never experienced before. A deep void, a crushing loneliness, because for the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing. The air in the courtroom was charged with tension. Margaret stood with her back straight and gaze firm, watching as Scarlett and Julian were escorted out of the room by officers. They had lost. The camera flashes blinked as soon as the judge struck the gavel for the last time. Based on the evidence presented and witness statements, this tribunal ratifies that Margaret is the sole and legitimate heir to the assets and companies of Charles. Any attempt at contestation will be considered fraud. Scarlett stood still for an instant, her eyes empty, as if her mind couldn't process what had just happened. It was the end. Julian, her supposed ally, looked at her with rage. You told me we would win. Scarlett could barely respond. She had lost everything, once again, and this time there was no return. Robert leaned slightly toward Margaret and whispered, You did it. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Because this wasn't just a legal victory, it was the culmination of years of suffering, humiliation, and resistance. She left the court with a sure step. Beside her, Mason walked in silence with his head low. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered finally. Margaret gave him a calm look and placed a hand on his arm. There is nothing to regret anymore, son. We just have to look forward. A few meters ahead, A group of reporters approached with microphones and cameras. "Mrs. Margaret, how do you feel having won this high-profile trial?" She stopped and looked at them with serenity. "It is not just a victory for me. It is a victory for anyone who has been trampled on, who has been humiliated, who has lost everything. Today, I demonstrated that the truth always finds its way." Some journalists nodded. Others took notes frantically. "Do you have anything to say to Scarlett and Julian?" Margaret sighed and replied calmly, "Everyone decides how they want to live their life. I decided to fight. They chose the path of lies. Now everyone has what they deserve." Without saying more, she walked through the crowd and got into the car waiting for her. As the vehicle drove away, she observed the landscape of the city through the window. Richmond was the same, but she wasn't anymore. Her war was over. Finally, she could live in peace. Life has a way of bringing us full circle. Scarlett, who once used her voice to wound, now finds silence in the humility of service. Margaret didn't just reclaim her fortune, she reclaimed her soul. She taught us that rock bottom can be the solid foundation on which we rebuild our lives. Her journey reminds us that patience is not weakness, and silence is not defeat. Sometimes, you have to wait for the storm to pass to show the world and yourself who you really are. What would you have done in Margaret's place? Could you offer a hand to the person who pushed you down? Tell us your story in the comments below. If you believe in the power of resilience, type "I am strong" to claim that energy today.